I want to welcome everybody. My name is Brian Hobbs, and I am the project manager for MARTA on the Streetcar East Extension project. I want to welcome you all today as we are excited to bring to you where we are on this project. I will say right now, before we get started, we can't hold the excitement in because this is a project that is moving forward, that we have funding for, and that we are collaborating with the City of Atlanta and BeltLine Inc. And as I said, we're excited to continue to bring this project to life. And we know that it's been a project that's been in the works for some time. What I want to do first tonight is start off with talking about the meeting purpose and why all of you are here. So, did I lose you? I'm sorry, there was a technical. There it is. All right. My apologies, I lost the screen there. But while we're all here tonight, and so I'm not going to be on camera as I go through the presentation, because I do want you all to focus on what we're here to talk about. That way, you're not focusing on me and I'm not popping in and out, but you're actually being able to see what we're bringing you here to review. So if we look at the agenda, we're going to start tonight with the meeting purpose. And the meeting purpose right now, it is our intent to provide you with an overview of where this project has been and where it is today. Now, as you know, this is a project that has had some extensive work performed by the Atlanta BeltLine, which has now been transferred over to MARTA. So what is the agenda for today? We'll talk about history and the background, and then we'll get a little bit into the alternative analysis that's been performed. We'll also talk about transit system connectivity, as well as we'll talk about alignment and stop locations for this project. And then we'll close today with the Q&A section that allow you to ask questions, and we'll try to answer as many as we can tonight. And what I want to do now is go through a little bit of the public meeting details. So number one, this meeting is being recorded and will be shared in the Streetcar East virtual room by June 4th. Now, the virtual room can be reached at tinyurl.com/streetcareast. This will also be posted in the chat room for you all to copy and utilize at a later date. We'll also, within the virtual room, you will find material related to the project, as well as you will find that we have a survey in which we ask that you complete before June 30th. Remember, we are here to gather your thoughts and comments on the project and where we are today. So we do ask that you take that survey. Now, there is a comment section within that survey, and we ask that you leave any lingering questions or comments that you may have that may not get answered tonight. As I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of people on this call, and we're going to get a lot of questions, and it is likely we will not answer all those questions tonight. So please leave your questions within that survey, or as you can see, we also have an email address for the project. Anything that you want to send us via email, you can do that as well. It can be a question, comment, or just anything of the nature related to the project, and we'll try to respond as soon as possible. And then I mentioned we will have a short Q&A session at the end of the presentation, and we ask that you place your questions within the Q&A room that you want to have answered. And if we don't get to it, we'll try to get to it as quickly as possible within the virtual room. So what I want to do right now is I want to start with a little project history. And so this project history is going to encompass the years between 2000 and 2017, the year the MARTA 2040 expansion plan was adopted. As mentioned earlier, a lot of work has already been done on this project. So it is imperative that we acknowledge that work and inform you of how that work ties into today's work. The knowledge and thought processes surrounding the original ideal of this project remains even with the transfer, as we've been fortunate enough to retain many of the brilliant minds who have worked on the original inception of this project. People like Catherine Owens, former BeltLine, Paul Patterson, which is a project consultant who's worked on Streetcar East, and Heather Al-Hadef and Shelley Peart, former City of Atlanta, bringing them all aboard the MARTA project team or retaining their involvement in some form. In fact, what I like to do right now is introduce Sean Green of the Atlanta BeltLine, who who is one of those brilliant minds, remaining on this project to provide a little bit of background himself.
Hey, Brian, thank you. Good evening, everybody. Sean from BeltLine, and I will be shutting off my screen or my camera so you can see what's going on the screen here. It's kind of a busy slide, but there's a lot of information that we wanted to make sure that that everybody understands as to what ABI is participating. ABI is partnering with City of Atlanta and MARTA on delivering this project. But you know, to get where we are, we came from somewhere, and that's really what I want to talk about today. You know, it started off obviously as a graduate student research thesis, and that was about 20 years ago. And the project gained so much grassroots support that ultimately it became a policy of the City of Atlanta to implement the BeltLine program of projects. And all of the BeltLine program of projects, the trails, the parks, the affordable housing, the jobs, all of that is hung off of the concept of the transit system. That it's the spine, it's the fundamental element of the BeltLine program of projects. And so, you know, we've done a bunch of feasibility stuff. We've done a bunch of alternatives analysis. We did a lot of community involvement and engagement. We still do all of that. But now we're working with MARTA specifically to get to the next part of this, which is now funded. And we're really, really, really excited about that. So the years 2005 to 2017, when BeltLine was doing a lot of environmental analysis and concept analysis and design and preliminary engineering to a certain extent. None of that is lost. All of that is been passed along. All of that is part of the MARTA project now in partnership with City and Atlanta BeltLine. So I think with that, Brian, I'll turn it back to you.
All right, thank you, Sean. I really appreciate it. So what I want to do now is move to some of the more recent events that have taken place. As many of you know, in 2016, a half-penny sales tax was passed, providing funding for many of the transit projects across the city of Atlanta. Now, the Streetcar East Extension project was one of those projects eligible to receive funding. Now, over the course of 2 years, MARTA has gone through a complex planning process which included significant public outreach to determine how the transit expansion program would be sequenced in a financially feasible way. Now, it was through this process and that the Streetcar East Expansion project was prioritized, and a funding plan was established to complete the project. And with that, you know, that brings us where we are today. The Streetcar East project is currently in the preliminary engineering phase. Now, during this time frame, MARTA has been in the process of validating all the previous work performed by COA, the City of Atlanta, and ABI on the project. Now, we have established an alignment, preferred alignment, I'll say that, and a proposed preferred alignment for the project. And we have also validated that the vehicle maintenance facility can accommodate the proposed expansion with some modifications. As you know, the current maintenance facility is not very large. But we do operate out of it, and it would have to be modified going forward. So one of the reasons that we are coming to you today is to gather your feedback via the virtual room survey on the following topics. This will include station locations. And what you will see with those, now that centers around the technical considerations and which constraints where stops can be located. So there are a lot of constraints and where we can put a stop. There are a lot of technical aspects that affect that. So we're going to ask for your input there. However, as you take the survey now, you will be shown some general locations of stops that have been developed so far. And we would like you to validate those locations, ensuring consistency with the community's priorities. So that is a very important aspect of things that we want you to weigh in on. Then we'll show you some alignment cross sections. These alignment cross sections, again, all of these are proposed alignment cross sections, and we want you to weigh in on them. These will show cross sections within the BeltLine corridor and within the in-street portions of the project. I would like everyone to remember that we are talking about a train being placed alongside a trail that has been in use for some time now. So the look and the feel will change significantly. We will also view within the in-street portions and the ideas around how space could be allocated. Now, this is an effort to ensure cyclists continue to be accommodated in this corridor. And so when looking and thinking about the views related to the in-street portions of the project, it is important to note that while MARTA will build and operate the streetcar, it is still within the city of Atlanta right of way, and the city owns that right of way. So any questions and or suggestions that we do receive, we will need to vet with the city to see if it is even feasible to implement. So that is why we are only taking your pulse on things now, and we want to get as much feedback as we can as we're focused on operational improvements and mitigation. Now, what I want to do now, I want to touch upon how we have continued to stay engaged with our jurisdictional partners, that being Atlanta BeltLine and the city of Atlanta throughout this entire process, as well as how we have continued to engage with stakeholders. Now, we currently hold regularly scheduled technical meetings for this project, which are really centered around the design process. The project team, which includes representatives from the city of Atlanta and Atlanta BeltLine, continues to meet to advance this project. Now, these meetings and collaboration will continue throughout the life of the project and beyond. We also have stayed engaged with many stakeholders, and many of these stakeholders have reached out to MARTA leadership to gain an understanding of where this project stands. Now, we have had detailed conversations about possible impacts and the possible mitigation strategies with many of the stakeholders to address any concerns that they may have so far. Now, what you will see on the slide here is a very high-level outline of what we heard from these various stakeholders. You may see on there where we have some of these stakeholders listed, stakeholders such as the King family, National Park Service, and churches, including Ebenezer Baptist Church. So what I want to do right now, you've all heard me talk enough about the project history and where and how we've gotten to where we are today. What I want to do is hand over the controls right now to Catherine Owens, who is project consultant for HNTB, to go over the more technical aspects of the presentation. Now, many of you may know Catherine from her time at the BeltLine, and that really speaks towards what I discussed earlier around still having a lot of institutional knowledge on the project team. And so, Catherine, what I'll do is hand it over to you.
Well, thank you, Brian. And luckily I unmuted before I was 5 minutes in. I will turn my video off, but really happy to be speaking with the community again about this project. As Brian said, you may or may not have seen me presenting alongside Sean several years ago, and I'm now here helping MARTA through HNTB trying to get the Streetcar East project extended. As he mentioned, and everyone else has done, I'll turn my video off, but just wanted to say hello and good evening. So the last time that the Atlanta BeltLine was out to the community talking about the environmental assessment work that they were doing, the categorical exclusion work they were doing to find the right alignment for this corridor was around late 2016, early 2017. The alignment that came out of that process looked very similar to the alignment that you see on the left side of your screen. It included a double track of transit along Edgewood Avenue. It went north on Randolph and then continued to the northeast along Auburn Avenue. And hopefully the cursor will be helpful. So east on Edgewood, north on Randolph, and then it found its way to the BeltLine through Auburn, and then came onto the BeltLine at that intersection at the BeltLine and Irwin Street, and continued north along, north and south actually, the last work that the community has seen, along the BeltLine corridor here, up and continued even further north than Ponce. The primary difference of what we're presenting tonight here on the left image is that with additional information that we were able to obtain restarting the effort and kind of we figured out it was more efficient to have double track here on Auburn Avenue instead of what was presented previously, which was if you were heading into downtown and south on the BeltLine, you would head west on Irwin Street and then south on Randolph. So a little bit more efficient coming along that 45-degree angle along Auburn and then back onto the BeltLine corridor. Just as part of reevaluating all of the work performed previously and taking on ownership of the project, MARTA wanted to make sure there may not be other efficiencies that could be found in the project, just making minor tweaks to the alignment. And one idea that came up was, why don't we continue to extend that same couplet cross section that we see downtown now, which is on Auburn, the streetcar heads west, and then on Edgewood, the streetcar heads east. So you'll see on the image on the right, what we're labeled here is alternative 2 is literally extending, excuse me, extending what is called the couplet along Auburn and Edgewood Avenue. Again, you would continue from Jackson Street east on Edgewood Avenue, head north to get to the BeltLine along Auburn, and then again, connect to the BeltLine there. And in the other direction, heading south on the BeltLine, you would come down Auburn and then continue along Auburn to make that connection street just west of Jackson Street. Because we were early enough along in the process, we were able to take a relatively high level look at how these two projects compared. And again, we were not so far along in detailed engineering that it was that we were a 7-page analysis, but we were looking at things like stakeholder feedback. There are different turns, and some of them were tighter turns than other turns. Were we creating additional noise? Was one route particularly faster or slower than the other route? On a scale, were the two relatively similar or relatively different when it came to construction impacts? We had new information like underground utility surveys, so we had a better sense of whether or not you had a major fiber line that was close to the surface. And then even thinking about maintenance requirements. I mean, once you do have significant turns, if you have too many things that differ between different routes, you have to treat the vehicles in a different way than if all vehicles are doing the same thing. And relative costs. Are they within, are they close enough to each other within a margin of error? A lot of times you'll see projects like this where one corridor could be extremely expensive, maybe just because of a utility impact, maybe because you have to take significant right-of-way, a parcel or something like that. Based on where we are with the analysis right now, we found that these two projects were relatively close to each other. Again, Auburn Avenue and Edgewood Avenue are relatively similar city streets with relatively similar utilities underground. The costs are within a margin of error. The maintenance, you have very similar movements between the two. Construction impacts, while we're not quite at the point of understanding how everything would be staged, again, you are close enough to each other that one does not outweigh the other. You're still removing or impacting 2 lanes of traffic, and you can sequence it in very specific ways to help mitigate that. Travel time, we actually saw on the couplet. Again, that's where we're having 1 train on Auburn and 1 train on Edgewood. It is a little bit quicker. You take about 2 blocks out of the westbound movement of the train. So you can see on this table, going westbound, you have a 6-minute route if you're staying on Edgewood. You have a 4-minute route if you continue along Auburn Avenue. But we did hear very direct feedback that there were some concerns about impacts to historic properties, the National Park Service along Auburn Avenue. We were concerned about pulling the alignment off of Edgewood in some cases because you were actually removing it from higher density housing and commercial areas. Construction and traffic impacts, again, relatively similar, but those 2 bullet points really said the right thing to do right now is continue advancing the double track along Edgewood. And so that is how we're progressing right now. We have continued to consider how it and how to quantify and what are the impacts in a little bit more detail associated with the double track along Edgewood. But we made that choice based on some of that stakeholder feedback that Brian talked about a little bit earlier. And so here we are talking to everyone today to say, this is what we've heard. And do you agree with this? Again, we all know this is the first time we've come out to the public at large about where MARTA is with this project right now. So again, just to reiterate, the double track on Edgewood is what the recommended alignment is currently. And that's primarily based on the feedback we had heard from the community so far. I've listed a handful of some of the points of interest along the alignment. What is interesting about that list is that it does not change. If you have the couplet versus the double track on Edgewood, that's why the couplet is, why the couplet was proposed on the original downtown streetcar, because those two roads are so close together that they can work in tandem with each other, assuming both are as developed as to support transit like this. Again, if you're going east or west, if you're going east from Jackson Street, you continue along Edgewood, you go north on Randolph, continue northeast on Auburn, and then you make that turn onto the BeltLine corridor, coming up to just around the Ponce City Market area, just south of Ponce de Leon. We also took a look at how this alignment connected or didn't connect with the existing bus routes and other MARTA assets. What was interesting, it was relatively plainly clear that it doesn't overlap a lot. One route, you only have 2 routes that literally touch each other from a planar perspective. But when you look at the table on the left, anything that you see slightly bolded, like Ponce City Market, King Center, Mercedes-Benz Stadium, Edgewood Retail District, King Center, there is some overlap in terms of what is reasonable to expect as a point of interest from the bus routes to what we considered a point of interest on the streetcar. And that's good for a healthy transit system. That means that other people in other areas can actually gain access to these points of interest, and you don't have to be able to only get to the streetcar. So it's sort of proof positive that this network of different transit options provides better connectivity and better access through the city of Atlanta. The other issue that, while a little weedy in the level of the technical nature of this topic, but Brian mentioned earlier on, is we have verified that the existing footprint of the maintenance facility that's under 7585 is sufficient enough to accommodate the extension of the the Streetcar East Extension. Again, that includes everything shown on the map previously, going all the way north to just south of Ponce. That is very important. It's not to say that MARTA isn't continuing to think about other expansions of the vehicle maintenance facility, or even finding other facilities, depending on what the next expansion of the streetcar line is. But it is critical to say, this is not a requirement. We do not have to expand this site to be able to accommodate this extension. So that could have been a pretty significant hurdle. I think the whole team was confident it would work, but we had to make sure that it would. We had to validate that so that we weren't a year, 2 years down the line and having to put the project on hold just for the sake of finding new real estate to be able to store and maintain our vehicles. That's not to say that there aren't modifications that need to happen. There are modifications that need to happen to be able to accommodate a few more vehicles. New vehicles are going to be required to function and operate this 2+ mile extension. The existing storage facility has 4 vehicles that it can store, and you can see in the grayed out track that is existing track. If you go down on Fort Street is how the vehicles get into the maintenance facility, and then coming along Auburn Avenue, those vehicles come in, again, just on the west side, and then are currently stored here in the middle of the facility. The current assumption is that there would be new track for storage on the south side of this site. And then we just wanted to note that the maintenance bays actually have room for 2 whole vehicles. The assumption is that there will always be at least 1 vehicle in there being maintained, checked. And so at the end of the day, 10 vehicles could be stored depending on how modifications are made on this site. And so that is critical. But I do want to reiterate that MARTA does continue to think about what this vehicle maintenance facility means as they consider expanding further north on the BeltLine, further south, or even expanding west from Centennial Olympic Park. Now, just kind of fundamentally, we wanted to remind everyone that this project continues to meet the original intention of the BeltLine needs and modes. This also meets the original criteria that were set forth in partnership between the City of Atlanta and MARTA when the halfpenny T-SPLOST was established. You know, the priorities there for any of these projects were focusing on safety and increased access throughout the City of Atlanta, expanding mobility for all potential users, extending the value of the existing streetcar. While that wasn't an express guideline or guiding principle of the halfpenny projects, it's definitely something we've all heard from residents about the existing streetcar. We want to make sure that that asset is leveraged and improved upon, but also that we're not just throwing a streetcar in the ground for the sake of throwing a streetcar in the ground, that this project really does react to projected growth and development along the corridor, really connecting folks that live in town at higher densities to higher density areas that have jobs and destinations like downtown Atlanta. The map that you're looking at on your right is a walk shed map. This darker brown here illustrates a 5-minute walk shed. The khaki right behind it is a 10-minute walk shed. The dark gray is reflective of the existing streetcar system. And again, that light gray is that 10-minute walk shed of the existing streetcar system. The blue dots along the corridor are the proposed station locations, and we'll talk about them in a minute. And then those purple diamonds scattered throughout are just trying to represent where we see access points that exist along the BeltLine corridor. So again, Brian mentioned that we'll be asking in the survey some very quantitative and ranked questions about where you would like to see stations, stops. These stops generally will have the same, particularly in street, the same level of design that we might see on the existing streetcar right now. Again, particularly along Edgewood and Irwin. We do not yet have the details of what those station area designs will look like beyond sort of that indicator. We also have not decided if the streetcar station areas will look particularly different along the BeltLine or not. They have continued to be designed for the ability to extend those streetcars to that 200, that larger double car configuration along the BeltLine, similar to their original assumptions that one day this could have the higher densities that would support 2 trains instead of just 1. The stations, again, were focused on ongoing and projected development and growth. We did think about kind of where the buses were, but we also did overlay that walk shed to make sure that what does exist and where people can access the corridor can continue to access stops. But we also have continued to think about how the Beltline is currently used and the in-street area, particularly around the Edgewood Commercial District, you know, placemaking, potential art siting, and other amenities. But you know, this is a very active artistic part of Atlanta, and it's been wonderful to see art on the Beltline continue to grow. Those types of things are part of where we want to place these stops. And always a lens of safety and security. Having that long continuous corridor certainly allows for clean lines of sight. You know, I know Beltline continues to think about safety on their end from, you know, a signage perspective, not creating places to hide. We have a very similar thought as we're going through how to establish what the standards are as we enter into thinking about the station area layouts and assumptions. So just a couple of technical pieces of information. The only thing that differs on the map here is we're showing you what we have approximated for travel time between stops. We've placed these stops between 1/3 and 1/2 of a mile from each other. That coincides with that walk shed map saying, okay, if you're at Auburn, you can still walk relatively easily to the destinations within most of the destinations you want to go to within 5 minutes. We are also assuming a 10 to 15 minute headway, which means if you miss a train by 10 seconds, you get to a stop and that train pulls away as you're entering the stop, you will have to wait no more than 9 minutes and 50 seconds or 14 minutes and 50 seconds until that next train shows up. So we're playing around with these ideas of 10 to 15 minute headways to determine how many vehicles we need, the cost to operate and maintain the system over the lifespan of the system. So it's very important, but MARTA's guidelines for this type of service do not go beyond that 15-minute headway. So they continue to work on that existing streetcar system too, to try and figure out how we might be able to start seeing similar headways there. And some of this, you know, there's sort of the devil in the details on that operating side of things as well. You know, where these vehicles lay over, where they switch drivers, things like that. Those are all going to be very much a part of those early stages of design as we go through the next 12 to 18 months. So over the next couple of slides, I'm going to start looking in a little bit more detail at the cross sections. I'm going to start, you'll see a little bit more zoomed in the areas along the Beltline and plan view, kind of looking aerially down at the alignment. We are still very early on in the process. So there are a lot of things you'll hear me say, we're still figuring it out. Part of this is we want you to know what we're still figuring out. We want you to tell us how you feel about that. If you have any initial thoughts or ideas, of course, they're always welcome. But really, you know, getting you ready for the next round of engagement. You'll see later that's going to be kind of the fall timeframe of this year. So it won't be too long before we come back out to the community to talk and give you more defined options. And we just wanted to make sure you understood. You do understand where we are and what we're thinking about and how things might have changed a little bit since the last time you heard from ABI. I am going to pause a little bit, particularly on these plan view slides, to give you an opportunity to digest it a little bit in front of your computer. I know that there are, again, we know there are a lot of questions that are going to be coming in that have already come in today and the last couple of weeks. So if you don't hear me speak for a second, that's only because I want you to have an opportunity to see it and think about it and jot down any notes for yourself if you want to. So the first cross section, again, this cross section is, you know, what is it going to look and feel like if you're standing in the corridor? This first cross section is of the Beltline corridor. The image that you're seeing is looking to the north. So if you were at Irwin Street, you would be looking towards Freedom Parkway. On the right of this image, there is the trail. On the left of the image, there is the streetcar double track, one train going in either direction. That is a consistent cross section throughout the Beltline corridor. The only thing that changes in this image is the trees on the left and the right can turn into buildings or houses or more trees or a park. You know, those adjacent land uses vary as we go up and down the Beltline, as you all know. I've heard a lot of different things over my years being involved with the Beltline. One of them is, well, how are you literally gonna put the transit on the trail itself? Beltline takes a lot of time and effort to design their trail, knowing that transit will come in the future. There are very discrete areas that we know certain small sections of the Beltline may have to be reconstructed to fit the new transit, but the trail, for the most part, is staying exactly where it is. All of those retaining walls that you see out there, all of the big heavy infrastructure that you see out there was designed to accept transit in the future. So now there's a corridor that allows for exclusive transit, and that allows for more reliable and consistent service. It's not competing with cars, it's not competing with signalization, so it gets where it needs to go. We also, you know, the longer this streetcar corridor continues to grow, the more you're increasing mobility for folks along within walking distance of that corridor. And this expansion project is part of just that. And I want to say, it goes without saying, but it should be said that just connecting with transit, and I mentioned it before, the existing streetcar to all the way up to the Poncey-Highland area does connect downtown Atlanta with these high density housing areas, jobs, and other destinations like historic Fourth Ward Park, the skate park, very close to the Carter Center, Freedom Parkway, all these things that people go to. And you know, now there's more workspace along the Beltline corridor, grocery stores. So you're really getting a lot more access to things that had been relatively disconnected if you didn't have your own car. Again, one of the things that we want to acknowledge, we don't have answers yet. We have a lot of ideas, a lot of thoughts. We want to hear what you're concerned about. We want you to tell us if there's something you don't think we are thinking about. So I wanted to spend a minute to highlight the areas that we know need a lot more thought. We know that there are a lot of movements at Irwin Street and the Beltline. How is that going to be managed? How is that going to be dealt with so that comfortably, so that people feel safe in that environment? Is it signalization? Is it, you know, is it restriction of different types of vehicles? You know, there are a lot of different ways to accommodate that. Is it, and so we're thinking through that process right now. We're also worried from a track crossing perspective. Beltline has provided a lot of access to the corridor. And we understand that those access points, you know, they have agreements with adjacent property owners, then that those property owners understand that transit could be coming in the future and is coming in the future. But, you know, we need to make sure that the proper control is there, that, you know, people, when they're coming from the west side, again, that left side of the image that you're looking at, can safely cross, have good lines of sight to see if a train is coming, to then get to the trail, or have clear signage to get to your station. And then generally along the corridor, this cross section that you're seeing here clearly is not an access point. You don't see people entering or exiting, but we all know and have been out there watching people walk across the grass, that grassy area around, or to the left, or to the west of the Beltline trail. There has to be some deterrence of those cross-track movements so that FTA, the state, everyone is comfortable that we have all done our due diligence to keep the citizens safe from accidentally running into a train or the other way around. We don't know what that barrier looks like. Is it just deterrence? Is it just a shrub? Is it, you know, some sort of landscape treatment? Is it a wall? You know, is it a small knee wall that just says, you know, this is a large curb, you should not cross? Is it literal fencing that you cannot cross? We're playing around with ideas that depending on adjacent land uses and the way we see people use the corridor now. So again, this is an area where I might pause for a second so that, you know, folks can soak this in a little bit. I put a little key up on the top right under the MARTA 2040 sign that is a reminder of what you're looking at. So if you're at the bottom of the page and you're looking to the top of the page, the train is on the left, the trail is on the right. This is just at the northern end, and I apologize. I think that you might not be able to see everything on this slide because my menu bar is dropped down and I can't make it go away. But I can certainly, obviously talk through it. This is just south of Ponce-de-Leon. Ford Factory Lofts is just on that southeast corner of that intersection. Ponce City Market is on the left side of the track. And the 725 mixed use development there is on the bottom right. You see the track work over on that left side. You've got the trail on the right side. The trail would not be reconstructed through this section at all. Part of the development at 725 was to try and figure out how to then now build trail so that trail wouldn't necessarily have to shut down during transit construction. And that was part of that negotiation there. But we also, again, want to be very direct with the community. Like Brian said, there are going to be changes to the environment on the Beltline corridor. You're going to see more controlled access to the development surrounding it, particularly on that west side. You're going to have limited access to the stairs at North Avenue. And then you're going to have impacts to what you're used to seeing, both from the shed at Ponce City Market and from the trail into town. Right now, we're still assuming a similar, you know, the technology is going to be the same. This is a streetcar. You're going to have those overhead electrical poles. The views are just going to be a little bit different. As we travel a little further south, this is just north of Ralph McGill. You've got that Georgia Power redevelopment there on the left side of the image. You have historic Fourth Ward Park way on the left side of the image. And then you can see, again, the transit is on the left of that corridor and the trail is on the right. You know, we used to have the large ramp from the trail down to the Beltline. I know that New City has been constructing, I believe they've finished construction of the new access point to accommodate their new development, but it will be a little bit more controlled than it was before. Impacts to the view shed similarly. You're still going to have transit between the trail and Fourth Ward, but you're going to also have a very different view because adjacent development as well. So there's a lot of changes happening, not only affiliated with building transit on the Beltline corridor. Again, continuing a little further south, we're here at the Fourth Ward Skate Park, just north of Freedom Parkway. This is probably the biggest delta in terms of access, even though there are two access points to the park and block lofts. You know, you're going to have transit there. This may be one of those areas that someone like FTA is going to be keenly aware of the fact that you have a lot of people playing in the park, that they may erratically run across to the trail, and you may start to see something a little bit more formal from a barrier perspective between that transit and the park. But again, the blue lines that you see, and I'll point them out with my cursor, these blue lines imply that right now we still think these are the right points of access. You've got a good access point down the street here. But you also have a good access point to the park and the playground on the west side of that park. You'll also see we're assuming that Freedom Highland stop location just south of Freedom Parkway. Again, as we continue south down that corridor, we're just at Lady Bird Grove and Mess Hall. Rathbun Steak here is on the right. Again, you would have slightly more controlled access to Lady Bird, as well as John Wesley Dobbs. And the other perspective here is, you know, the folks sitting at Lady Bird will have a different view shed from the patio onto the Beltline corridor. They may have to modify that corridor to accommodate how the transit comes through here. You can see on this alignment that, you know, there's not really any touching of the corridor to that sort of grayer area that is the patio, but, you know, construction can get messy and we may need to tweak certain things to be able to match the grades appropriately, get the appropriate stormwater in there. These are things we don't have answers to right now. We're getting there where when we are ready, we'll go to the immediately adjacent property owners, have a conversation with them directly. Those types of conversations do not come to the public. I am not implying that we need anything, you know, we need to do anything at Lady Bird. What I'm saying is, it's close enough that, you know, we have to look at those details to see if we do or don't. And that's going to be one of those next steps along in this process of design and development. And this is something, you know, I know the Beltline has gone through, MARTA has gone through when they've done their other corridor projects. The city has to do the same thing when they're developing roads. Everyone went through this when the downtown streetcar was originally constructed. And coming down to that favorite intersection of Irwin and the Beltline, to the left of the Beltline, again, we're here, the Beltline is here, Irwin Street is going east-west. Here is Sampson Street. It's a little busy, but the streetcar would continue south. Again, if you're going south, come onto Irwin Street and then slide right on to Auburn Avenue. Ooh, excuse me. I want to pause here for a second, and we'll pause similarly in a slide in just a minute. One of the questions that you're going to be asked in the survey is, do you support either partial or full closure of certain sections of existing streets to personal vehicle use, to your cars? I've heard from several different folks, just generally, you know, hey, is anyone ever going to stop having cars go on Irwin between Sampson and Krog Street? We're looking right now at what the impact of that would be. These are city streets. If this were to happen, it would have to be something that not just MARTA recommends, but the city is in support of, and the residents are in support of as well. So this is really just a poll. Please do not infer that we've made any sort of decision, but you'll see a very similar, I'll say something very similar when we get down to Edgewood, talking about how do we mitigate existing congestion issues, existing areas that are very popular from a pedestrian and cyclist perspective. You know, how do we allocate the space as we are now adding another mode? This mode is very good for access, very good for folks to move around the city of Atlanta, but it's just another layer of thought that we need to go through to make sure that everyone is accommodated. So shifting down to Edgewood Avenue, again, as I mentioned earlier on, we're assuming a double track transit along Edgewood Avenue. You're going to see this option. We'll have two options for how we accommodate bike facilities along Edgewood Avenue or between two corridors. This is a cycle track. This is what a cycle track is what you see on Peachtree Center. We have a very few cycle tracks here in Atlanta where you have cyclists basically having their own set of lanes on one side of the street. This is very appealing along Edgewood, particularly through a few blocks that have zero driveways. then, and what it does is it allows for an extremely protected scenario where the cyclist is not competing with a lot of turning movements like you experience on Edgewood right now if you were going into town. So the bike lane on the north side of the street right now conflicts with a lot of driveways. On the other side, that south side of the street, there just aren't any driveways. This is also an interesting alignment because it allows for continued connection, assuming this goes all the way to the BeltLine along Edgewood Avenue at the all the way along Edgewood Avenue to the BeltLine. Then cyclists can then use that ramp that exists to make that connection, to strong connection to the BeltLine. We again would have to really think through transitions from adjacent bike facilities. You're going to be transitioning from a bike lane that you have to, cross to another side of the street, depending on which direction you're going in. And you also have to think about your bike turning movements as they come in contact with the transit vehicle rail lines. And not to put too fine a point on it, MARTA's not interested in pretending there might be some concerns about something like this. The reality is, and what you're looking at here is between Jackson Street and Boulevard. The reality is you're basically taking away all of the on-street parking on Edgewood to be able to prioritize pedestrians, cyclists, transit, the users of this corridor from a transportation perspective. It's very much an interesting concept that actually started coming to this team's mind after we knew and understood that the city was very interested in shifting priorities along this corridor, finding ways to either widen the sidewalk or reprioritize just with striping in the near term. How do you reprioritize and protect those pedestrians and cyclists along such a busy corridor from folks that are not just in a car? So again, this is another section of the in-street portion that we've asked, do you support reducing access or limiting access or removing access to certain blocks from cars? And in the survey, there is an option to say, I do not support this. So we definitely appreciate that there are going to be a lot of very strong opinions about this. A lot of this is coming from interest in safety of all users. We talked a little bit about this section as coming down from the BeltLine at the Irwin and BeltLine intersection. But similarly with the double track on Auburn, there are definitely impacts as well. There is removal of on-street parking and loading and unloading along this corridor. You do need additional sidewalks just immediately adjacent to the Water Tower Park. That is to provide ADA access to the proposed station that is located there. You can see it's right between that park and the Stoveworks development. And the last option we'll look at here is a couplet for cyclists, not for the streetcar. So you can see in these cross sections that the streetcar is still double tracked on Edgewood. You've got a streetcar going in either direction. The couplet for the cyclist is more of a continuation of what is out there already west of Jackson Street. So where the bike lanes parallel the existing streetcar, those bike lanes would continue through to at least Boulevard. It is nice for the cyclist because you have a consistent cross section until you get to Boulevard, and then you have to figure out as a cyclist what you're going to do. It reduces on-street parking along Edgewood, but it doesn't essentially eliminate it along the blocks that it is implemented, or doesn't have to eliminate it. It could create a conflict zone on Auburn in the visitor bus loading area. This is currently unused space that is used by it's unallocated space, that is used by the King Center for loading and unloading on tour buses. And so if you are traveling eastbound on Auburn on your bike, you want to make sure that it is clear for both bus drivers and cyclists who's going where and when. But as I mentioned, that also creates a slightly in or less direct connection to the Beltline corridor itself. And usually cyclists, if there's not a clear direction, they make the direction that they're most comfortable with. So there's just a little bit of unknown, there's just not going to be a consistent way that everyone goes and gains access to the Beltline. And then just general management of traffic in shared lanes. Similar to the other plan views, it's just not as zoomed in, but I did want to highlight that, what's in here is a concept, not fully vetted, not all of the design details are figured out. You'll notice, and I apologize again if you're not seeing this, but we're showing the idea of on-street parking here along Auburn. This would be one lane in either direction, and then a bike lane that would be heading east here. Again, nothing is written in stone. This is just this is a very easy way for us designers to understand what space is available. You have pretty standard widths, and so within what is available, we've laid this out to be able to accommodate cars as well as some parking, maybe some loading and unloading, and a bike lane. And then again, you can see on Edgewood, you have less impact on street parking. This is Boulevard. Again, you've got these split stations and you've got on-street parking on both sides of Boulevard that you would not have if you had a cycle track on Edgewood. And with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Brian. I know everyone's eager to get into questions, so thank you for going through all of that with me.
All right, thank you, Catherine. All right, so I hope that sparked a lot of good questions from you all. And so what I'll do now is talk about the path forward and where we're going before we jump into the Q&A section. All right. So if you look on the screen here, as you have heard, we will continue our work over the next 12 to 18 months to complete preliminary engineering. Now, by the time that we are ready to transition this project to final design, now we would have completed many of the things and determined things such as stop locations, the VMF layout, in-street, in-corridor cross sections. We will have an expectation of the barriers between the trail and transit, which are adjacent to the properties from GDOT. We also will have conceptual typical stop area layouts, as well as plans centered around safety and security. We'll also have some stormwater plans as well, and we will know a little bit more about the electrification of the transit system going through the trail area. Go to the next slide. There we are. Now, so as you can imagine, receiving your input from today and input going forward is very important. I think we've kind of emphasized it on multiple times that there are still a lot of decisions that are not finalized. We're moving, we've got a lot that we've designed, a lot that we've looked at, but there's a lot that hasn't been finalized. So your input from today is very important. So I implore you to go and take our survey before June 30th. Now, as you can see here on the screen, we are scheduled to have 2 more public meetings, one in September and one in February. Now, during those meetings, at least, we will provide you with more details to obtain more feedback from you. Now, I will say, please continue to send the team emails related to the project as needed outside of these formal public meetings, because it is very important. Now, when we do come back to you in September, we're likely to discuss the in-street alignment details, mitigation measures for traffic impacts, as well as some of the detailed discussions on materials under consideration for things like, corridors and barriers. All right, good to know. And just to talk a little bit about many of the other elements and phases of work that will take place. So once we leave preliminary engineering, we'll enter final design. That phase is where we will complete the VMF modification, the design of that. We will have detailed structural engineering, and we'll have final drainage and grading designs, as well as we will finalize the system detail design, which includes traction power substations and OCS systems. And we'll finally move into Streetcar East construction. Now, as you see here, this will take approximately 3 years of construction, which will culminate with a revenue service date within 2027. So with that, I hope that what you have seen today has, again, sparked some excitement about the future of the project and where it's going. Now, what I want to do now is spend a little time answering some of the questions posed in the Q&A room during the meeting, as well as some of the questions we received early on before the meeting actually started. This meeting is intended to end about 7:30. So as you can see, we have a little over 24 minutes to get some questions in. So we'll start that. Now, if you do plan on leaving, again, I want to emphasize that the survey, please go to the virtual room and take the survey before June 30th. And the survey can be found in the public engagement page indicated by the blue dot below, and access by clicking the Take Survey button. So please go do that if you're leaving right now. But with that, what I want to do is answer a few questions. So what I'm going to do right now, I'm going to start with some of the questions I received, or we received before the meeting actually took place tonight. Then I'll go into our Q&A room and pull some of the questions out of there to be answered. So the first question, and I will turn my camera back on for this. The first question centers around station locations. We kind of discussed this a little bit, but the question is, are the station locations shown in the graphic the final station locations? And right now, so we do have Paul Patterson on the call. So I do want Paul to answer this question around stations and station locations.
Okay. Well, I mean, picking up from the initial work done by the BeltLine, that was the starting point for the station locations. More than anything, the work that we've done has been just working with how the land use changes have occurred over the last few years, and sort of right sizing it and just fitting it in space. There's a couple of things just notable about the BeltLine that we actually did play with coming up with those is, if you take a look at the alignment, it's almost entirely on a large radius curve, which was kind of creating an issue where we like to generally locate stations on straight sections. And we've actually adapted kind of the standard to figure out a way to locate curves on very large radius curves. So it actually fits better in the corridor. But again, it's all about that, finding that right balance between the spacing, hitting the right spots to serve the most people and minimize the impacts. Again, specifically, I hope that answers the question. I guess it's a bit of an art, less of a science, but we're trying to manage all the competing factors that affect the location. One interesting one is the in-street station on Boulevard. There really is a difference, when we jump to the double track for accessing the King Center and the Edgewood Commercial District. With the streetcar no longer turning back at Jackson, we didn't feel there would not be adequate access to return to downtown unless we located a stop nearer for both directions. So that is a part of the reason for the Boulevard stop.
Excellent. Thank you, Paul. What I want to do now is, because I'm seeing a theme here within some of the questions centered around the BeltLine in general and transit on the BeltLine. And so what I want to do is, Sean Green with the BeltLine, I want to ask you to kind of elaborate on what the vision was of the BeltLine. I think some people may not realize that the BeltLine had there was always a vision of transit onto the BeltLine.
Yeah, the original thesis was all about a transit system, coupling it with economic development and adaptive reuse of existing infrastructure. And so the BeltLine corridor is a former railroad corridor, had a lot of freight movement on it for a really long time. And then the freight movements kind of went away, and it became vacant space. It became dead space. It became the thing that everybody turned their back to. And the intention of trying to get the transit system started up other thoughts of, well, if there's going to be a transit system, why can't there also be a parallel trail system? Everybody bought into it. And so to date, what we've been able to deliver is a lot of the trail system, and we still have a lot more to go. We've been able to deliver some of the park work. We've been able to deliver some of the affordable housing work. We've been able to deliver a lot on the jobs front. The public art's been fantastic. The environmental remediation and historic preservation. I mean, that's why we have the East Side Trail and reused the 100-year-old Ponce Bridge over it. So we've been somewhat successful with that. And now we've got a funding stream to finally get the transit in. And we're, in my best Bostonian, we're just wicked excited to do it.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you, Sean. All right. So the next question I have here out of the Q&A section, the Q&A room, is will MARTA be applying for federal funds to complete this extension and or the rest of the BeltLine rail and further non-BeltLine extension? I'll answer this. So what right now at MARTA, we haven't formally finalized our funding strategy for the expansion program. While we have put down on paper where we're going and while we have an idea of where we want to go, federal funding comes and goes in different mechanisms. So formally finalizing that and being able to share that, that's something we're still doing at the time. This project, however, was intended for local funding. So as it stands, we're still moving forward with this project as being locally funded. That's not to say federal funds couldn't be used at some point, but we are intending this project to be locally funded. All right. The next question I am going to, let's see. Oh, you guys are asking a lot here. All right. Let's see here. All right. And we kind of answered this one, but seems to be a reoccurring theme. And so Paul, this comes to you as well. This is speaking about what protection or physical separation will be installed to ensure personal and privately operated vehicles do not enter the transit routes and right of way. So it seems to be a reoccurring theme here, I see.
Okay, well, I guess there's the two situations. There's clearly the street running section where, I mean, it is intended to be fully shared with cars as present. So I'm assuming that means once we get up on the BeltLine, how do we keep cars from, say, following the train? We haven't got into the details, and it is a very complicated intersection there at Irwin, where it turns onto the BeltLine. So we haven't gotten down to the details or thinking through. I mean, one, we need to make it very clear visually, and we intend to make it very clear visually that it is not a place for cars to drive. And so there'll be plenty of channelization and whatnot. And plus it will just be very, very difficult to drive. We don't intend, there are different methods we could use to construct the track. But I think all the ones that we are considering would not be drivable. So I don't really see that being an issue, but I mean, the broader issue of safety and keeping, cars and pedestrians and bikes from running into one another is definitely something we're giving a lot of attention to. We already have been, and we will in more detail going forward.
And Brian, do you mind if I suggest maybe Sean talk to the Homeland Security efforts that I know BeltLine has gone through?
No, go ahead. Yes, sir.
And I can give you a hint, Sean.
So BeltLine has gone through some Homeland Security things. Thank you, Catherine. We have hardened the corridor. The original vision of the BeltLine was to kind of be as open and airy. I believe our previous director of design used the phrase, the word diaphanous. I'd never heard it before, and now I use it as much as I possibly can. But the intention was for it to be the thing that kind of everybody breathed in and out to it. And then the terrorists hit London, hit New York a couple times, and we're able to do some really bad damage to people by, driving trucks onto pedestrian facilities. And so we've installed bollards, we've installed big rocks, we've installed trees, and tried to, as gracefully as possible, prevent that kind of stuff from happening in Atlanta. Brian.
Thank you for that, Sean. All right, so let's go to the next question here. So this question seems to be a theme, a reoccurring theme as well. And I know it's a very important one for everyone, but this centers around the streetcar and its movement. So are there plans to address the frequent suspension / disruption to streetcar service due to vehicles blocking the right of way and or lots of traffic due to events? It goes on to say, I don't believe the streetcar will be able to gain sufficient ridership to warrant this investment if MARTA and the city of Atlanta cannot commit to an executable, enforceable plan to guarantee a clear right-of-way for the streetcar along its entire route. This is more of a twofold question. I'll answer some of it, and then I may ask some of my panelists here who may want to jump in as well. But what I will say is we have done a study. We have studied as to why the streetcar currently and some of its efficiencies, while we're not seeing the efficiency that we would want to see. And in that study, we found that there are some things that we can do, some things with technology to be exact, implementing transit signal priority, doing some other things with regards to helping the current streetcar move at a much more efficient rate. And so we have looked into doing that. Those are some of the things we will be doing. And so, yes, we've looked into the frequent slowdown of the streetcar and how we can help mitigate that going forward. Now, I'll ask any of my panelists if they have anything on that as well to answer as well.
Brian, if I can just add just a little bit. Some of the analysis that we have done, that was one of the first things we did when we started this project, is we took a look, or this latest phase of this project, is we took a look at what were some of the issues being experienced on the Atlanta streetcar and how can we include fixing those as part of this project. And one of the things we did take a look at was sort of the whole dedicated lane issue, and is the dedicated lane going to solve the slowness issue? And so we've modeled the corridor and taken a look at the difference of if it's exclusive lanes could be provided, and if that is the cause for the slowdown. And it actually, and there were a couple of findings and a couple of takeaways, is that the bulk of the slowdown is in what we call the upper loop, which is sort of north and west of Peachtree. But along Auburn and Edgewood, it's actually the traffic signals and the timing of the signals that causes the vast majority of the delay. As Brian was talking about, the transit signal priority is our best strategy to approach that. But there's sort of a second side to that question, which is sort of inherent with the streetcar and in-street rail, which are these, the parked car illegally, the driveway blockage, the fire truck, the ambulance, these types of things. These are sort of the day-to-day things that are more affected by enforcement and policy and just teaching and grooming sort of the public to get out of the way of the streetcar. those are a bit more challenging and are dealt with on a day-to-day basis, and which certainly we would look to, increase the efficiency, but they're sort of separate issues. And I don't know that one would solve the other.
So thank you, Paul. All right. The next question I have here talks a little bit about dedicated right-of-way. So for the on-street cross sections, is there a feasible option where the streetcar is not mixing traffic, but has its own dedicated right-of-way? So I ask either Catherine or Paul to answer that question.
Well, I think Paul started to answer that question in the initial analysis. I mean, I think some folks thought, oh, if we just have dedicated right-of-way, we're going to be fine with this new connection. Well, this is going to be inextricably linked to the existing streetcar. So, it's always nice to know MARTA and the city are continuing to think about how one can improve the other and understand that they work as a singular system. I think the other side of it is this is exactly why we are polling you about your level of comfort to limit vehicular use along Edgewood, right? And even that Irwin Street section as well. But this is where people are seeing a lot of congestion during peak hours, as well as during, weekend and event situations. And again, the question is asking for legitimately and reasonably asking for something that would require support on all fronts. And that, it is a city street. This is a situation where MARTA is coming into the city's right of way. And so it would have to be very much a supported policy to limit the use of personal vehicles in certain sections to then prioritize that active transit user, the pedestrians, the cyclists, the scooter users, and the transit riders and bus riders. So please do think about those questions really critically about the level of support that you have, because that could, just removing vehicles or even removing on-street parking can reduce the amount of enforcement that's required to deal with folks that just park poorly on the street and go over the white line, and that suddenly holds up a streetcar. So there are these very subtle things that happen in design and these design decisions that have these longer term implications. And so I guess I say that and then want to offer Paul the opportunity to add on to any of that, if you think you need to.
No, I mean, I think that covers it. I mean, the one thing I might just mention as one of the aspects, just in comparison to what we have studied in the couplet versus the double track. I mean, part of that was examining, what, like, even to dedicate a lane, without closing Edgewood completely, it would be impossible to dedicate lanes without, still allowing auto access. So it was only in the couplet that would even be possible. And so that was one of the reasons we looked at that. I mean, it was set aside for other reasons. But we really have been trying to do everything we can and identify all those levers that can be pulled to improve the efficiency.
Great. Thank you, Catherine and Paul. All right. So the next question I want to ask here, it says, is the current streetcar being widely used? Has a study been conducted as to the expected usage for the proposed route? I'll go ahead and answer this very quickly. The current streetcar, due to the pandemic, is not currently widely used. And we know that there are some reservations around how it was used beforehand. Now, before we actually, implemented or thought about implementing an extension, and during this current time frame that we've been studying the preliminary engineering, we have ran studies. And those studies give us ridership data. And the ridership data, based on where we're trying to achieve with regards to the end of line of the streetcar currently, or the future, it is to increase the ridership. So we do expect a very sizable increase with regards to the ridership, because we want to make sure the streetcar is going to destinations that people want to go to. All right, let's see. Next question that I have on deck is, will you have ADA issues at Ralph McGill stop given large grade change to surface streets? That is another technical question there.
Yeah, I can start there. You know, the Ralph McGill stop is at the Beltline grade and actually leans into the east side at grade. And I think you're asking, how do you get to Fourth Ward Park? The original ramp, well, I know that what the new city development is putting in there includes elevators as well, to make sure that you continue to have ADA accessibility down to Fourth Ward Park. So, you know, the idea here is that everything within the Beltline corridor proper is ADA accessible. You know, I'll ask Sean to chime in when he wants to or feels appropriate to talk about what agreements were put in place, you know, between that development and where the Beltline sits now. But that's always been a critical point to, if there was something that was accessible before and it went away, needed to come back. So it should remain ADA accessible even between the city street and the Beltline corridor itself.
Yeah, the agreement between Atlanta BeltLine Inc. And New City, who's developing the old Georgia Power laydown yard, is pretty extensive, but it was basically trying to create almost as much of a seamless connection between the Beltline corridor and that development. And if the context of the question, Brian, is more towards the issue of local bus connectivity, with, you know, somebody boarding or alighting whatever bus number that is there along Ralph McGill, and then, you know, there's the opportunity to use the network, the new network of streets that will be built out by New City to be able to get in and out of that development there. But then, Paul, I'd ask you, or back to Catherine, whether or not there is a ramp proposal from Ralph McGill sidewalk up to Beltline.
Yeah, that was kind of how I interpreted that question. And to answer, and that actually influenced where we located the station. So one, we wanted to locate it near sort of the center of gravity of development and activity, which is going to be around the new development. I mean, just by this mere size of it. But also it allowed a ramp to be run on the west side, a pedestrian access from the station along the west side that can ramp down, because it'll take quite a while to ramp down to the lower level, which is about 30 feet lower on Ralph McGill. So it'd be an ADA ramp that would run all the way up to the station on the west side of the guideway. While on the east side, on the trail side, there's actually a stair over there, but it wouldn't be very feasible to do a ramp on that side. So we felt it was a good opportunity, and it actually made the location of the station more comfortably fit a little bit farther away from Ralph McGill.
Excellent. Thank you all for that answer. The next question, I know we're running out of time here, but the next question centers around controlled access. So I think, Catherine, you mentioned more controlled access, and I'm starting to see a lot of questions around what does that actually mean, controlled and limited access, as the use of a lot of barriers will prevent users from accessing parks, shopping, and dining. Have you surveyed the public to see if they feel that the trade-off of a loss or restriction of access is worth the construction of a streetcar along the Beltline? I think that first part with regards to the survey of the public, that's what we're doing now. But
right.
Catherine, you want to explain a little bit about the loss and limited control or more controlled access?
Yeah, I think that you hit the nail on the head there, Brian. It's not reduction in access. It's just more controlled access, right? No one's going to, lock the door or keep you away from whether it's North Avenue or Ponce City Market or, or Ladybird or whatever the case may be. It really is just a more measured way of getting to where you're going. I think Sean was mentioning earlier, that original vision of the, not gardens, but it was extremely landscaped, extremely open on both sides. The reality of having a streetcar, and this is literally a 90-ton vehicle going down the corridor anywhere between 2 miles an hour and up to, in some places, maybe limited, maybe even up to 25 miles an hour for a short section of corridor. We want to make sure you're safe. So it's not reduction of access, it's just more controlled. And I don't want to get too far out in front of my skis, but we're not talking about gates, we're talking about, maybe there's a small fence that is deterring you from crossing into the track work, but you still have these same public street access points, right? Where you can still get to John Wesley Dobbs, you can still get to Ponce, you can still get to Ralph McGill. That is integral to having access to transit, but also integral to having access to the destinations that you're going to. And again, I want to reiterate that we will be back out in the fall to talk about this in a lot more detail. MARTA will be in a better position to have a stronger statement about exactly what that would look like. And so again, it's not about removing access, it's about just keeping folks safe. And again, the intent here with the streetcar is to provide more access for city residents along a lot of these popular corridors by giving them an opportunity to use public transit to get there. So the idea of just wanting to walk across the grass to get to a shop you like to go to instead of following the sidewalk that gets you there, we're not just looking at that one person. We're trying to provide more access citywide to a lot of the assets that the city has been growing over the last 10 or 15 years along this corridor.
Thank you, Catherine. So it looks like it is past our time. I do see there are a lot of questions out here that have not been answered tonight. As I alluded to earlier, what we will be doing is trying to get to as many of these as we can and post the answers within the virtual room that you will have access to from the survey. I know I see a lot of questions around the future of transit, the different modes. I also see a lot of questions, possible modes out there. I also see a lot of questions centered around speeding up the timeline of implementation. So what I'll ask you all again, to go into the virtual room, take the survey, and definitely once you will see at some point here, once we compile all of these questions that we did not answer tonight, we'll try to answer as many as we can and get them posted as well. And so with that, what I like to do is thank you all for attending tonight. And again, if you have any questions, any concerns, you can see my info there, and you can actually send an email to us at streetcareast@itsmarta.com, and we'll be do our best to answer as soon as possible. Again, thank you for joining us, and we hope that you continue to stay engaged, and we'll be back soon. Thank you.